There is a city of 800,000 people. It is modern, prosperous, and proud. Its harbor is one of the 4 busiest on the planet. Its leaders are educated men who govern from marble halls. And one summer morning in 1892, they are told that people have begun dying in the streets. Their response is not to warn anyone. Their response is to say nothing at all. For 6 days, the city of Hamburg stays silent. No announcement, no quarantine, no public warning of any kind. The water keeps flowing from the taps. People keep drinking it. The factories keep running. The ships keep sailing. And the dead keep piling up. By the time the truth comes out, thousands are already infected. Within 6 weeks, roughly 10,000 people are gone. Not from a disease that could not have been stopped. From a decision that was made in a boardroom by men who valued their shipping contracts more than the lives of the people they were supposed to protect. And here is what makes this story so difficult to let go of. The bacterium that killed those 10,000 people had been identified almost a decade earlier. The solution was already known, and it was deliberately, consciously set aside. Welcome to Epoch Reset. I am Elliot Carter, and this channel exists because history has a habit of burying the stories that matter most. If you are new here, subscribe now, because what we do on this channel is not comfortable. We dig into the corners of the 19th century that official histories tend to gloss over, and what we find there keeps having an uncanny way of looking familiar. Today, we are going inside the cholera age, not the medical textbook version, the other version, the one about power, money, silence, and the moment the modern surveillance state was born from the wreckage of a pandemic. Stay with me, because before this is over, I am going to show you something about the world you live in right now that you will not be able to unsee. The invisible enemy arrives. To understand what cholera did to the 19th century, you first need to understand what the 19th century felt like before it arrived. Europe and North America were experiencing a kind of intoxication. Cities were growing at a rate the world had never seen. Steam engines were rewriting the rules of distance. Telegraph wires were threading continents together. There was a widespread and genuine sense that humanity was finally winning. That science and industry and rational government were going to solve everything. And then, in 1817, something crawled out of the Ganges Delta and began moving along the trade routes of the world. Cholera. The disease had existed before, quietly, in the Indian subcontinent. But the explosion of global commerce in the early 19th century gave it wings it had never had. It moved along shipping lanes and pilgrimage routes and military supply lines with a speed and efficiency that stunned the doctors who tried to track it. By 1820, it had reached modern-day Myanmar and Sri Lanka. Within a year, it had killed more than 100,000 people in Indonesia alone and was being reported in the Philippines. Then it reached the Persian Gulf, then Turkey, then Syria, then the southern edges of Russia. Europe watched from what it assumed was a safe distance. Cholera was described in the press of that era as an oriental disease, something that happened to other people in other places. The colonial imagination of the 19th century had a gift for that kind of comfortable categorization. Pestilence belonged to the East. Civilization belonged to the West. The geography of disease in the popular mind mapped neatly onto the geography of empire. That comfortable delusion lasted until 1831. That year, a ship from the Baltic docked at Sunderland on the northeast coast of England. Passengers were ill. The disease they carried was soon confirmed as cholera. Within months, it had reached Gateshead, Newcastle, and then, in 1832, London itself. The official death registry for that outbreak recorded 6,536 dead in the capital alone. In Paris, the same year, 20,000 people died out of a population of 650,000. Across France, the total figure approached 100,000. In Hungary, records from that period suggest approximately 100,000 deaths. These are the numbers that appear in contemporaneous government tallies, though historians note that underreporting was common and the true totals were likely higher. Now, here is something worth sitting with for a moment. The disease that arrived in Europe in 1831 was not, by any medical standard of the time, understood. Nobody knew what caused it, nobody agreed on how it spread, and nobody had anything resembling an effective treatment. What they did have was fear. And fear, as we will see again and again in this story, turned out to be one of the most politically powerful forces of the entire century. The speed of cholera's killing was unlike anything European cities had encountered in living memory. A person could feel perfectly healthy at breakfast and be dead before supper. The symptoms were horrifying in their visibility: violent purging, agonizing cramps, dehydration so severe that the blood thickened and the skin took on a bluish, waxy pallor that witnesses described as looking like death itself. There was no dignity in it. There was no warning. There was no remedy that worked with any consistency. You drank water, or you breathed air, or you touched something, and then you died. Or you did not. No one could reliably tell you which outcome awaited you. That uncertainty was crucial. It meant that the explanation of why cholera killed the person next door, but not you, could not come from medicine. It had to come from somewhere else. And in the 19th century, it came from two places: religion and politics. Both of those explanations, as we will see, served the powerful rather than the powerless in ways that were not always accidental. But before we get to the politics, there is one more piece of the scientific picture that we need to place on the table, because there is a puzzle buried inside the history of cholera that has bothered researchers for a long time, and it points towards something darker than simple ignorance. By the time cholera reached Europe for the second major wave in the late 1820s and early 1830s, there was already a competing theory about how the disease spread. It was not widely accepted. It was, in fact, aggressively suppressed. And the reason it was suppressed tells you almost everything you need to know about what was really at stake. What do you think? Does it seem plausible to you that a government would choose silence over safety to protect its trade? Or does the simpler explanation, plain incompetence, seem more convincing? Drop your thoughts in the comments. This is exactly the kind of question this community exists to wrestle with. Two theories and one very inconvenient truth. There was a battle going on inside 19th century medicine, and it was not really about medicine at all. It was about economics. It was about who controlled the movement of goods and people across borders. And the stakes were enormous. On one side of the debate were the contagionists. They believed cholera was transmitted from person to person or through contaminated material. If they were right, the logical response to an outbreak was quarantine. Stop the ships, close the borders, isolate the infected. Simple, brutal, effective, but also catastrophically expensive for anyone whose livelihood depended on trade moving freely across the world. On the other side were the miasmatists. They believed disease arose spontaneously from putrid air, from the stench of decomposing organic matter, from what they called miasma. If they were right, quarantine was not only useless, but actively harmful, an obstacle to commerce with no medical justification. You could not quarantine air. You could clean up your city, improve sanitation, drain the swamps. But you could not close a port because a ship smelled bad. Now, here is what the historical record shows, and it is not a comfortable thing to look at directly. The miasma theory was not simply the scientific consensus of the time. It was also the position strongly preferred by the merchant and shipping classes who stood to lose the most from quarantine. A remarkable number of government commissions and medical boards in the 1830s and 1840s arrived at pro-miasma conclusions at exactly the moment when their conclusions would be most financially convenient. Some scholars who have reviewed the official correspondence of that period describe a pattern that is, at minimum, worth questioning. The first International Sanitary Conference, convened in Paris in 1851, was attended by the most important scientists and public health officials in Europe. Its official purpose was to establish a shared framework for responding to cholera. Its unofficial result was almost nothing. The conference produced no binding agreement, no standardized quarantine policy, no shared database of outbreak information. A scholar writing for the World Health Organization decades later described these gatherings as the foundation of modern international health cooperation, which is true, but that description somewhat softens what actually happened in those rooms. What happened was that British delegates, representing the world's largest maritime empire, fought strenuously against any quarantine measures that might slow the movement of their ships. The minutes of those meetings, preserved in diplomatic archives, show delegate after delegate from trading nations arguing against the very measures that their own medical advisors were privately recommending. And at the same time, in the streets of London and Paris and Hamburg and New York, ordinary people were dying by the tens of thousands, with no clear guidance from their governments about what was actually killing them. The waterborne theory, the one that would eventually prove correct, did not arrive fully formed from nowhere. Hints of it were circulating as early as the 1840s. A Florentine anatomist named Filippo Pacini identified the Vibrio cholerae bacterium in 1854, though his findings were largely ignored for decades. And in that same year, a London physician named John Snow conducted an investigation that should have settled the question once and for all. Snow was not a romantic figure. He was a methodical, careful man who had already built a reputation as an anesthesiologist. He was the personal anesthetist to Queen Victoria. He was not a crank or an outsider. But when a devastating outbreak struck the Soho district of London in the late summer of 1854, killing roughly 500 people in just 10 days, Snow became something else entirely. He became the closest thing the 19th century had to a detective in the modern sense. Using mortality reports from the Registrar General's office and supplementing them with information gathered through interviews by the Reverend Henry Whitehead, Snow began plotting the deaths on a map of the neighborhood. Each death was a mark, each water pump was a landmark. The pattern that emerged was, once you saw it, impossible to ignore. The deaths clustered with overwhelming density around a single water pump on Broad Street. People who lived nearer to other pumps survived at far higher rates. Brewery workers in the area who drank beer rather than water from the pump escaped almost entirely. Poorhouse residents who drew from a separate well survived as well. Snow brought his findings to the local authorities. The pump handle on Broad Street was removed in September of 1854. The outbreak subsided, though Snow himself was careful to note that it was likely already declining before the handle came off. His famous map, eventually published in 1855, showed not just where people had died, but why. It was one of the first times in history that data had been used in this way to trace the path of a disease. And the official response to all of this? The London Board of Health, despite acknowledging Snow's work, officially attributed the 1854 epidemic to miasma. The board's own published report, which appeared in 1855, contradicted Snow's conclusion. He was not publicly supported. His theory was not widely accepted for years afterward. He died in 1858, having never received the institutional recognition that his work deserved. There is something in that sequence of events that does not sit easily. A man produces rigorous, verifiable evidence. The bodies of evidence point clearly in one direction. The official body responsible for public health looks at that evidence and produces a report pointing in the opposite direction. Accounts differ on whether this was scientific conservatism, institutional inertia, or something more deliberate. But here is what we can say with confidence. The miasma theory, which was wrong, remained the dominant official position for years after solid evidence against it existed. And during those years, the policies shaped by that theory kept the trade routes open and the factories running. That is not an accusation. That is what the record shows. What you make of it is your own business. And I want to know what you make of it, so tell me in the comments. Does the persistence of miasma theory in official circles, long after the evidence against it had accumulated, look like honest scientific uncertainty to you? Or does it look like something else? The rumor machine and the men who sold salvation. Before we go any further into the politics of cholera, we need to talk about what happened to ordinary people caught in the middle of all this. Because while the governments were arguing about trade routes and the scientists were arguing about miasma versus contagion, there was a third force at work. And that force was making an extraordinary amount of money. Information in the 19th century did not travel the way it does today. What it did do was spread. News of an outbreak would reach a city before the disease did, arriving in the form of rumor, exaggeration, and panic. Travelers brought stories. Sailors brought stories. The emerging popular press, hungry for sensation and circulation, amplified every story into something larger than itself. The result was something historians have called a geography of fear, a landscape in which terror moved faster than either the disease or the facts about it. In Paris in 1832, there were widespread rumors that the cholera epidemic was in fact a deliberate poisoning campaign by the government or by malicious foreigners. Crowds attacked people they suspected of poisoning wells. People were killed by mobs convinced, with no evidence whatsoever, that they were agents of a plague conspiracy. A parliamentary study referenced in historical scholarship on the period described the collective panic as in some ways more dangerous than the disease itself, because it drove the poor, the very people most vulnerable to cholera, out of infected areas and into the streets, where they spread the disease further. Cholera riots were not limited to France. They broke out in Russia, where the government's quarantine measures were experienced as tyrannical impositions on the poor. In England, there were violent confrontations between working-class communities and the medical authorities who came to remove the sick. In multiple cities, hospitals were attacked by crowds convinced that doctors were killing rather than treating the patients inside. The historical record on this is remarkably consistent across countries and languages. The institutional response to cholera was so poorly communicated and so visibly class-stratified that large segments of the population simply did not believe what they were being told. And into that vacuum of trust, that enormous empty space between what governments were saying and what people were willing to believe, stepped a remarkable industry. The patent medicine trade of the 19th century was one of the most sophisticated commercial enterprises of its age, and the cholera epidemics were among its greatest gifts. The mechanics of it were simple and brutal. A product would be given an authoritative-sounding name, something with the word doctor or professor or scientific or compound in it. It would be advertised in the emerging popular press with testimonials from people who had supposedly survived cholera after taking the remedy. The ingredients were usually not disclosed because the law in both Britain and America for most of the century did not require them to be. And what those ingredients often turned out to be, when they were later analyzed, was a mixture of alcohol, opium, or in some cases, genuinely toxic substances. Perry Davis, a shoemaker from Massachusetts, marketed his opium-based preparation as a cure for cholera throughout the mid-19th century. His bottles carried the assurance that the product was purely vegetable and that no family should be without it. A product called Bonneur's electromagnetic bathing fluid listed cholera as one of the many conditions it claimed to cure, alongside epilepsy, paralysis, and what the label diplomatically called female complaints. William Radham sold something he called microbe killer on both sides of the Atlantic in the 1890s, with the phrase "cures all diseases" embossed directly on the bottle. Chemical analysis later showed it to be a dilute solution of sulfuric acid colored with red wine. This was being sold to people in the grip of a pandemic. The scale of this industry is difficult to overstate. Some historians of American commerce have described the patent medicine trade as one of the first true mass-market consumer industries in the United States, pioneering advertising techniques, national distribution networks, and celebrity endorsements that would later become standard business practice. It was not a fringe operation. It was not a small collection of eccentric con men on the edges of polite society. It was a major commercial force with connections to the newspaper industry, which depended on patent medicine advertising for a substantial portion of its revenue. Some press historians have noted that this financial relationship had a predictable effect on how newspapers covered the patent medicine industry, which is to say, they did not cover it critically at all. The fear machine and the remedy machine were, in this sense, mutually sustaining. The press amplified fear. Fear created demand. Demand was met by the remedy industry, which paid for advertising in the press. The press profited. More fear followed. The people who suffered most from cholera, the poor, the working class, the inhabitants of the overcrowded and unsanitary neighborhoods that the disease preferred, were also the most likely to spend what little money they had on remedies that could not help them and sometimes actively harmed them. There is a question underneath all of this that I want to put directly to you. When panic is profitable, who has an incentive to calm it down? And when calm requires information that disrupts trade or exposes institutional failure, who has an incentive to keep people panicking instead? These are not new questions. They are questions that the cholera age asked with extraordinary sharpness. And I think you already know what the answers looked like. But stay with me, because the next part of this story is where the picture gets genuinely strange. If you find this kind of investigation as compelling as I do, now is a good time to subscribe to Epoch Reset. Every episode we make is built on exactly this kind of work. Going into the documentary record, reading the things that were not supposed to be read together, and asking the questions that the official narrative tends to skip over. The subscribe button is right there. And it costs you nothing except a few minutes of your time, which I promise to spend wisely. The quarantine as weapon here is where the story stops being about medicine and becomes something else entirely. Here's where the shadow falls across the whole picture, and you start to see the outline of something that was not accidental, not merely convenient, but deliberately designed. The quarantine is, in its basic form, a medical concept. You isolate the sick to protect the healthy. You hold ships in harbor until their passengers can be assessed. You create a physical barrier between the infected and the uninfected. In theory, it is a public health tool and nothing more. In practice, in the 19th century, it became something that theory had not anticipated. What the cholera epidemics provided for the first time in modern history was a legitimate-sounding justification for something that governments had always wanted but could never quite justify: the systematic, bureaucratic control of the movement of people. Not just of ships or goods, but of people, specific categories of people. And if you look at who got quarantined and who got exempted across the multiple waves of cholera in the 19th century, a pattern emerges that is difficult to explain purely on medical grounds. Consider the Russian Empire during the 1831 pandemic. The cholera riots of that year, documented extensively in Russian historical archives and in the scholarship of later historians, broke out in large part because the quarantine measures imposed by the Tsarist government were experienced with considerable justification as falling primarily on the poor and on minority ethnic and religious communities. Wealthy travelers could often arrange to bypass quarantine stations through influence or bribery. Working class and peasant populations could not. The disease was described in official Russian correspondence as something arriving from outside, something foreign, something that needed to be stopped at the border. The political implications of that framing in a multi-ethnic empire that was actively trying to manage questions of national identity and loyalty were not subtle. Or consider the situation in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt, which established formal quarantine boards in 1831 in response to the second pandemic. The Ottoman Supreme Council of Health, set up in 1838, eventually oversaw 59 separate quarantine stations. The record suggests these structures did indeed provide some protection against plague, even if their usefulness against cholera was limited. But they also, as historians of the period have noted, served as instruments of imperial administration, mechanisms through which the movement of certain populations, particularly Mecca pilgrims coming from Africa and South Asia, could be monitored, recorded, and controlled. The Egyptian delegate at the 1892 International Sanitary Conference in Venice reportedly told the assembled European delegates that his country was being made to serve as a sentinel to guard Europe, and was being told to pay for the privilege. The international sanitary conferences themselves are a remarkable document of how health policy and geopolitics were woven together in this period. The first conference, held in Paris in 1851, was nominally about harmonizing quarantine rules. In practice, it was about who got to move through the world freely and who did not. British delegates, representing an empire whose entire economic model depended on uninterrupted maritime trade, fought consistently against quarantine measures that would apply to their ships. Easier, as one historian of the conferences has described it, to externalize the quarantine burden to the East, to insist that the problem originated in India or in the Middle East, and that the solution should be applied there rather than in the ports of Liverpool or Southampton. The result was a system in which quarantine was applied with extraordinary unevenness. Ships from wealthy trading nations, particularly British ships, navigated a web of exemptions and diplomatic exceptions that ships from poorer nations could not access. The pilgrimage routes used by Muslim travelers from Africa and South Asia were subjected to strict surveillance and quarantine at stations in the Red Sea, stations that were administered by international boards on which European powers held disproportionate influence. All of this was justified in the language of public health. It was organized along the lines of commerce and empire. And then there is the domestic dimension, which is perhaps the most directly relevant to the world we live in today. Because inside the cities of Europe and North America, the cholera epidemics gave local governments an argument for a kind of administrative reach they had never previously attempted: the creation of sanitary authorities with powers of inspection, registration, and enforcement was presented as a purely medical response to a medical crisis. But what it also created, for the first time, was the infrastructure of a modern surveillance state. In Britain, the Public Health Act of 1848 created a General Board of Health with powers to investigate local sanitary conditions, compel local authorities to take action, and remove people from their homes if they were deemed a public health risk. Similar legislation appeared across Europe in the following decades. In each case, the justification was cholera. In each case, what was built was a bureaucratic apparatus that did not go away when the epidemic ended. It expanded. It found new applications. It became, over the course of the 19th century, the foundation of the administrative state that governs population in the modern world. The first systematic population registers in several European countries were established in this period, explicitly linked to the need to track disease outbreaks. The first compulsory death registration systems, which provided governments with detailed information about where people lived, what they died of, and who their families were, emerged directly from the demands of epidemic management. These were not sinister inventions in themselves. Better data about death genuinely helped public health. But they were also, simultaneously, an extraordinary expansion of state knowledge about the population. And that expansion did not reverse when the epidemics subsided. What does that feel like to you? Does it feel like an accidental byproduct of a genuine health emergency? Or does it feel like something that was, at least in part, a feature rather than a bug? I am not telling you what to think. I am asking you to look at the sequence of events and draw your own line between them. Tell me in the comments what conclusion that line leads you to, because I read every single one of them, and the conversation in this community is genuinely one of the best parts of doing this work. Hamburg, 1892. The silence that killed. Everything we have discussed so far in this episode, the suppression of inconvenient science, the weaponization of quarantine, the machinery of panic and profit, it all comes together in a single city, in a single summer, in a catastrophe that was so foreseeable, so preventable, and so politically determined that it has the quality of a parable. Except it is not a parable, it is one of the most thoroughly documented urban disasters of the 19th century. Hamburg in 1892 was, by any external measure, a city at the height of its powers. With a population of roughly 800,000, it was the fourth largest port in the world. Its harbor handled an extraordinary volume of global trade. Its merchant families were wealthy, influential, and deeply connected to the political structure of the German Empire. The city-state had retained considerable autonomy after German unification in 1871, and it was governed by a Senate composed primarily of those same merchant families, men who understood the world primarily in terms of commerce and who had organized the city's institutions accordingly. They had also, for years, been receiving warnings. Robert Koch, the German bacteriologist who identified the Vibrio cholerae bacterium in 1883 and whose work was by the 1880s widely respected across the scientific community, had made clear that cholera was a waterborne disease. Several European cities had responded to this knowledge by investing in sand filtration systems for their municipal water supplies. Hamburg had not. The city senate had consistently blocked the expenditure required. And the reason, as documented in the work of Cambridge historian Sir Richard Evans, whose book Death in Hamburg draws on the city's own administrative archives, was straightforwardly economic. Accepting that cholera spread through water would imply quarantine measures that would disrupt trade. The city's water supply was drawn from the river Elbe and delivered largely unfiltered to households connected to the municipal system. A dissertation from the 1880s, preserved in German academic records, surveyed the biological contents of that water and found more than 50 distinct species of organisms living in it. This was known, this was documented, and nothing was done about it. In August of 1892, a period of unusual heat and low water levels in the Elbe allowed contaminated effluent from the harbor district, where migrant workers from Russia were housed in overcrowded conditions without proper sanitation, to reach the city's water intake. The Vibrio cholerae bacterium, under those conditions, found its way into every pipe and tap connected to Hamburg's central water system. Within hours, it was being drunk by hundreds of thousands of people across the city. The first confirmed case appeared on the night of the 14th to the 15th of August. Within days, it was clear to the city's medical authorities that an epidemic was underway. And then something extraordinary happened, or rather, something extraordinary did not happen. The Hamburg authorities, according to Evans's detailed reconstruction of the administrative record, refused to officially confirm the presence of cholera in the city for approximately 6 days. During those 6 days, no public announcement was made. The water continued to flow, the schools continued to operate, the shipping continued normally. There is a dissertation-length question buried in those 6 days. Were the authorities simply in denial, as governments often are, in the early stages of a crisis? Or were they making a calculated decision to protect the city's commercial reputation and trade relationships? The record is not fully clear on the intentions, but the consequences were unambiguous. By the time the truth became impossible to conceal, the disease had spread to thousands. The numbers kept by the Hamburg authorities during the outbreak were themselves later described by contemporaries as unreliable. As one contemporaneous medical publication noted, the figures were kept under lock and key so as not to jeopardize the economy and trade. When Robert Koch arrived in Hamburg at the invitation of the desperate city government, he found conditions that he described in his dispatched reports as worse than anything he had seen in India. The overcrowded working-class neighborhoods along the harbor, the same neighborhoods that had been excluded from the major sewage improvements made to wealthier districts, had mortality rates that were several times those of the merchant quarters. The disease, which the city's leaders had tried to describe as something external, something foreign, something that could be controlled by the right kind of management, turned out to have been living in the water that the poor had been drinking for years. Roughly 10,000 people died in Hamburg in the summer and autumn of 1892. The precise number remains uncertain because the recording system broke down under the pressure of the epidemic, and some historians suggest the true toll was higher. In the 1893 elections that followed the disaster, the merchant-dominated Senate was voted out. The Social Democrats, who had long argued for public health investment and sanitation reform, won all of the city's parliamentary seats. A memorial was later built between the town hall and the stock exchange as a reminder, in the words of those who commissioned it, of the responsibility that politics and finance carry in times of epidemic. But here is the part of the Hamburg story that I want you to sit with. The water filtration system that would have prevented the epidemic, the system that Koch and the city's own medical board had been recommending for years, was eventually built. It was built after the epidemic. The construction had, in fact, already begun, tentatively, before the outbreak. It was simply not complete. If the Senate had moved faster by even a year or two, 10,000 people would not have died. The infrastructure existed. The knowledge existed. The money existed. What did not exist was the political will to spend it on the poor, on the workers, on the people whose deaths, when they came, would be counted in contested ledgers that nobody wanted to read too carefully. The Hamburg epidemic is often cited in public health literature as a cautionary tale about the dangers of suppressing information during a crisis. That is true and important. But I think it is also something more specific than that. It is a case study in how the infrastructure of denial, the bureaucratic habit of choosing commerce over transparency, choosing the comfort of the powerful over the safety of the powerless, does not simply cause individual harm. It builds into the system. It becomes the system. And then the system produces exactly the outcome it was shaped to produce. The inheritance we did not ask for. By the end of the 19th century, cholera had not been defeated. It had simply been pushed back to the margins, to the parts of the world that lacked the infrastructure to fight it. The sixth pandemic, which began in India in 1899 and lasted until 1923, killed hundreds of thousands more. The seventh pandemic is technically still ongoing, classified as such by the World Health Organization since 1961, though confined today largely to regions without access to clean water and sanitation. But the most enduring legacy of the cholera age is not the disease. It is the architecture that the disease built. And this is the part of the story that I want to close with, because I think it is the part that matters most for understanding the world as it currently exists. Over the course of the 19th century, in direct response to the cholera epidemics, governments across Europe and North America constructed something entirely new. They built the bureaucratic skeleton of the modern state, registration systems that tracked births, deaths, and addresses, sanitary inspectorates that could enter private homes, quarantine authorities with power to detain individuals, national health boards with the power to override local decisions, international agreements that created, for the first time, a shared framework for monitoring and controlling the movement of people across borders in the name of disease prevention. Each of these things was justified, sincerely in many cases, as a public health measure, and many of them did, eventually, contribute to reducing the death toll from infectious disease. The sewage systems that Bazalgette built for London after the Great Stink of 1858, finally prompted by cholera's persistent return to the city, saved countless lives and remain largely intact today. The registration of deaths gave epidemiologists tools they still use. The international sanitary conferences created the intellectual and diplomatic framework that eventually became the World Health Organization. None of that is in dispute. But what is also true, and what the historical record shows with considerable clarity, is that the same legislative and administrative structures that protected public health were simultaneously used for purposes that had nothing to do with health. Quarantine was applied unequally along lines of class and race and nationality. The populations that were most systematically registered and tracked were the poorest and the most politically marginal. The language of sanitation was used in multiple documented instances to justify the forcible removal of working-class communities from desirable urban land. The registration systems created to track disease also tracked political affiliation, criminal history, and ethnic identity. Michel Foucault, writing in a very different context, described the emergence of what he called biopower, the techniques through which the modern state came to govern not just the actions of its subjects, but their bodies, their health, their movement, and their lives. Foucault did not write primarily about cholera, but the cholera age is, in retrospect, one of the most vivid demonstrations of exactly what he meant. The epidemic was real. The threat was real. The fear was real. And all of that reality was used to build something that outlasted the emergency that justified it. The question of what we should do with that inheritance is genuinely difficult, and I am not going to pretend there is a clean answer. The public health systems built in the wake of the cholera epidemics have saved millions of lives. The surveillance systems built alongside them have also been used to oppress, to exclude, and to control populations who had no say in the design of those systems. Both of those things are true simultaneously. And the people who built those systems, the scientists and the administrators and the politicians, were not cartoonish villains. They were people operating in a specific historical moment with specific interests and specific blind spots, making decisions whose consequences rippled forward in time, far beyond what any of them could have anticipated. What they did not do, in many cases, was ask the question that most needed asking. Who does this serve? Who benefits from the way this rule is written? Who is protected by this system, and who is controlled by it? Those are not comfortable questions in a crisis. They are not questions that get asked easily when people are dying in the streets and there is pressure to do something, anything, immediately. But they are the questions that, if left unasked, tend to produce answers that were baked in from the beginning. And that is why we are here. That is why this channel exists. Not to tell you what to think, but to make sure that the questions get asked out loud by as many people as possible, with as much of the historical record in hand as we can manage. If you have made it this far, I want to say something to you directly. The story of the cholera age is not a history lesson. It is a mirror, the pattern of an emergency that justifies a new kind of control, of institutions that expand during a crisis and do not fully contract afterward, of information being managed rather than shared in the interests of powerful stakeholders. That pattern does not belong to the 19th century. It belongs to every century, including this one. What do you think is really going on underneath the official history of public health? Does the story I have laid out here read to you as an unfortunate series of mistakes made under pressure? Or does it feel like something more deliberate, more structural, more persistent? I genuinely want to know. Tell me in the comments. Not because I want to push you toward any particular conclusion, but because the conversation between people who are actually paying attention to these questions is one of the most valuable things that exists. And if you have not yet subscribed to Epoch Reset, let me make a simple case for why you should. Every episode we make is built on this kind of work, not speculation, not conspiracy. Primary sources, documented history, and the questions that the official narrative tends to leave blank. We are building something here, a community of people who think the past matters, who believe that the buried stories are often the most important ones, and who are willing to sit with difficult questions rather than reach for easy answers. That community is growing, and I would genuinely like you to be part of it. Subscribe. Leave a comment. Tell a friend who would find this as compelling as you do. Because the 19th century is not finished with us yet, and neither, I suspect, are the questions it raises. I am Elliot Carter. This is Epoch Reset. I will see you in the next one.